Hello and welcome to this amazing episode of Crush Your Mountain Wellness. I have with me today an incredible doctor, scientist, intellectual, and we're going to pick his brains on some things. Particularly, we're going to talk primarily about genomics, epigenetics, and how that can help your health. Let me introduce my dear friend. This is Dr. Mikolaj Raszek. Mikolaj Raszek was a founder and director of Genomics Incorporated, based in Edmonton, Canada. Now, he founded this company in 2015 and currently manages the corporation. He holds a degree in honors genetics as well as a doctorate degree in biochemistry, both obtained at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. During graduate studies, the doctor became excited by combinatorial biosynthesis and its applications in genomics. Now, what we're talking about now is the development of the act of combining the body, those parts of the body, down on a cellular level, okay, and down on a genetic level, and how it applies to your genes, how we can improve your genes. Upon his return to Canada in 2013, the doctor found employment at the Edmonton Center, but now it was a young company dedicated to exploring the commercial benefits of genomic research in Canadian livestock industry. But now he was motivated to start his own company, as well as work for another company as well that he co-founded. We're going to talk to him about biosynthesis. We're going to talk to him about all of these fantastic new technologies that are out there that are for the benefit of our health, primarily when it comes to weight loss, diabetes, hypertension, things that we deal with day to day. Dr. Mikolaj Raszek, Witaj I witaj po angielsku. I just screwed up my introduction again, but in any language, what that means is welcome my friend to Crush Your Mountain.
You got the word Vitai correctly, so I definitely got that part. Very pleasant surprise, right on.
Now, for those that don't know, because I did not tell them where you were born, would you please let them know that language?
So I was born in Poland, and that's basically the language was Polish, not a surprise. And I moved to Canada when my parents decided to emigrate to Canada immediately after the fall of communism. So I grew up in communist Poland. Of course, right now, Poland is no longer communist since then. There's been a few decades ago. And thank goodness, because Poland has been beautifully revitalized, and it's a very beautiful country to visit right now. Highly recommend it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's definitely one of the places that I would love to visit. Like I said, I tend to be a bit of I'm a wandering spirit, although I have not traveled as much as I would have loved to. But so there's always time, as long as you're breathing. That said, tell us a little bit more. I forgot to mention this, so friends, so please be advised that Dr. Raszek, Mikolaj has his own YouTube channel, and there he discusses issues of COVID-19 as well as the genetics involved in that. Let's touch base, let's start there, okay? Because,
Sure.
It's so important that people understand just how we can protect ourselves, what the genetics have told us most recently, and then again, are there any specific things that deal with or that COVID-19 would affect specific genome types?
So the answer is yes. That's been studied, where there has been correlations been made between specific variants or mutations, if you will, in human population that might predispose such individuals to the greater likelihood of either infection by COVID-19, or B, once infected to greater severity. And those studies are ongoing. But at the moment, these are correlations. So it's not like it would be advisable for one to look at their DNA to see whether they might be predisposed. An example of that would be, I remember from the top of my head, in a European population is known to have inherited fragments of Neanderthal genomes, and part of that genome from Neanderthals happens to have mutations that predispose individuals to increased likelihood from suffering from more severe COVID-19. So this gives you an example how diverse this can be, because that same genetics possibly in the past, the reason why they might have been retained because they might have given that population certain protection against potentially other infectious agents. So you can see genetics, it can come and go, and at one point in history it might be something beneficial, at another time it might not be. So yes, definitely the genetic predispositions have been studied, but it's not like we have a sanctioned genetic test to determine your likelihood of either infection or experiencing severe outcomes. But one that I think is actually interesting is the epigenetic test of biological aging. And the reason why that one I think is interesting is because biological aging is not the same as chronological aging. So chronological aging is, of course, the number of your age, but we all know that different people can age differently just by looking at people the same age, right? So we're all familiar with that.
I don't know that. Just okay, helping. Not a lot of my listeners, I'm not sure, are not quite clear on what the difference between genetics and epigenetics is. I really want them to know that, and you're the man that can help them with that.
So okay, so then let's pause for a moment and then give you that explanation. So genetics you inherit from your parents, right? So that is information that is then supposed to be divided identically throughout all of your cells, throughout your body. Of course, that doesn't happen, because when genetic content is divided, then you can always introduce mutations. That's exactly what happens with the virus, by the way, which is why the virus has such a great capacity to rapidly change. But overall, the genetics is supposed to be copied the same between cell to cell to cell to cell. So the genetic information you inherited from your parents is static for all intents and purposes. So it's supposed to be the same. So if you take my blood or biopsy or saliva and you were to look at my genetics, you will get to the bottom of it, and it should always look the same. Now, epigenetics is different. Epigenetics is a chemical information that can be put on top of your DNA, and that's highly variable. So it's variable between different tissues in your body, and it's based on environmental response, and it helps to regulate how your genetics are used. So that's epigenetics. Epi stands for on top, hence makes sense, epigenetics, on top of genetics, because if this is your DNA, you put a chemical on top of your DNA, and that tells the cell, hey, I want to use these genes instead of these genes. And that can be very different from different one tissue to another. Now you can take blood and look at the epigenetics in certain type of cells, and you can actually very accurately determine your biological aging based on looking at specific sites where that chemical attachment to DNA takes place. And it tracks your chronological aging very well, but sometimes it can tell you information that, hey, your biological aging is actually not the same as your chronological aging. If it's below your chronological aging, it means you are aging slower than your chronological aging. And if it's higher than your chronological aging, then it means you're aging faster. And what that means is that if that rate of biological aging is faster than your actual chronological aging, there's body of evidence continuously coming out indicating that such individuals are more likely to experience negative health outcomes. And that actually appears to also include the likelihood of experiencing severe outcomes from COVID-19 post-infection. So that's one test that, however, this is a test that hasn't been verified. There's just information coming out. It's just that epigenetic testing itself is a very well studied modality, and it's been used a lot already in research. And again, it shows that people with health problems usually indicate that their biological rate is faster. And what's really cool about it is that it's malleable. So if you change your lifestyle and adopt healthier lifestyle, or if you take certain intervention, such as, say, you take medications that are supposed to improve your these disease outcomes or treatment, you can reduce that rate of biological aging. Something really, really cool.
I got to tell you something. So much has come up for me with that. You know, I'm going to go back to the Neanderthal DNA. You know, I got to touch base with that. But I'll tell you, it's funny that you mentioned all of that, because I recently did a full body scan, medical scan with my FMD, functional medical doctor, and I found out that I'm actually biologically 5 years younger than my chronological age.
Well, that's what we're talking about, biological aging. So your biological aging rate is slower than your chronological aging, which would indicate you are A, taking very good care of your lifestyle, or B, you're well endowed with good genetics that most likely help the quality of your immune system.
Well, I'll tell you, there was a time some years ago, and it was the opposite. I was like 10 years older than my age. So hopefully the lifestyle changes is what did it. So the idea, folks, number one, keep in mind that, as I've told you before, your doctor is not your boss. Your doctor is your teammate to help you to move to the path toward health. Number two, you can always change and reverse your chronological age. And that means that your health improves, your wellness improves, and your lifespan extends. So why not try that? Why not do that? Seek ways of doing that. Now,
I agree.
Dr. Mikolaj, tell us more about the Neanderthal aspect, okay, in the DNA of some Europeans, because I find that fascinating. Are you saying that there's a little bit of caveman in all of us?
Not in all of us, no. There's it's not found in all of ethnicities around the world. It's I believe, this is from memory, that this is found in Europeans. And even in Europeans might be too broad of a term. So it's only in a segment of global population where you see fragments of Neanderthal genome. And we know this is because Neanderthal genomes have been decoded from fossils. DNA can be preserved very well for a very long time. Of course, it degrades over time. So it's not necessarily very easy to decode that sequence with high accuracy, but it has been decoded. And I'm sure there's gaps in there of information, but based on the information that was obtained, you could tell that fragments of human genomes are in certain populations are related to the genome found in Neanderthals. Human genome right now is seen as a singular entity, but in reality, if we had the capacity to decode the genomes of all of the people in the world, you would see that there actually would be very great variation in the genome so that certain populations might have information that is not even present anywhere else in other corners of the world. Now, we're not talking about massive changes, right? Human genome is huge. It's enormous, which makes sense because it's a program code that determine how a single cell, which was the fertilized egg, was supposed to create a human being. So then you can appreciate that program code has to be enormous in order to be able to determine how do you go from a single cell to that multi-trillion organism that we are right now. And on top of that, that program code runs us every day, right? So it's, of course, it's enormous, but there can be great varieties between different ethnicities. And that makes sense, right? Because in the past, different groups of people might have experienced greater isolation, and therefore they would be stuck in certain areas that would evolve on its own in one geographical location different from another geographical location. Right now, we live in a world where we can interchange those genomes on much greater scale.
That's beautiful. You know, I'll tell you something. We think in terms of how that affects the development of communities. You know, say, for instance, you have certain areas that I know you've heard of, the blue zone areas. You know, and those are areas where they tend to live longer. But it's just not just through lifestyle, but also there are genetics involved because they pass everything on through the genes. Have you heard the information about how trauma is now considered to be passed on genetically?
Yes, and that's where epigenetics comes in, actually. So that means supposedly, in theory, you might be able to pass on certain level of life experience onto the next generation. However, when you produce the gametes, so the sperm and the eggs, epigenetic information is supposed to be wiped out. So you start with a clean slate. But it's suspected that some of this epigenetic information might sneak through from one generation to another, and you could be passing on trauma for sure. Yes, it's been shown. I haven't studied this information in great detail at all, but I do recall some information that I read on this. I know that that experience of trauma was shown in animal models for sure, and I think in humans that might have been maybe exemplified in the context of starvation.
So one can say that an entire group of individuals can actually experience a trauma, case in point like the Holocaust, or something on that great level, that type of event, and that the energy, if you will, of that can be passed on to generations, if you will.
Possibly. We don't know how granular that can be. So to what degree does it actually take place? To what extent? So we should be careful not to maybe make too broad of statements that here you go, you can pass on life experiences no matter what. As I mentioned, my understanding is that normally when you produce sperm and egg or eggs, depending, of course, on your biological sex, then that information is supposed to be wiped out, but perhaps not all of it. But yes, within the assumption that indeed, if you can pass on trauma, it just goes to show you that ideally we should be treating each other with as much kindness as possible, right? So that we can reduce that likelihood to the greater degree, because trauma experience obviously is not a good to anyone. And then imagine if you pass on certain personal characteristics that you have to burden with the next generation, if you can pass on elements of trauma, definitely not good. So hopefully we will figure out how to do it eventually so that we can absolutely minimize doing psychological harm to one another as a humanity. Obviously, we're not there yet. We have lots of wars, we have lots of conflict, and so on. But I personally believe we are constantly improving and getting better as humanity. It's just a very slow process.
Indeed. Well, I'll tell you, it's well said. Transferring of positive energies, transferring of positive experiences can elevate an entire planet of people. So hopefully we can all take that to heart, Here's something else I want to chat with you about. Okay, getting back to the whole disease situation here, the pandemic here, we're looking at, first it was COVID-19, then it was then we had another variant, then we had another variant, Omicron. Now there's something entirely new, monkeypox. Okay, where does our study of genetics take us, and as far as protecting ourselves, first of all, and then perhaps even finding a cure?
So with the genetics, right now, the technology that we're employing to monitor genetics, whether that's our own personal genetics or viral genetics, this is the same technology that is used in both instances. It's referred to as next generation sequencing. This is a technology that I'm very interested in, and that's the technology that my own business is dependent on, because that's the technology used in the services that I promote, which is decoding your genome, personal genomes, to learn about your predispositions, or perhaps to help to diagnose specific diseases depending on the need of the test. Now, that same technology, which allows to very rapidly decode genetic information, is now used to monitor viruses. And that's exactly what's happening with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We never had this available to us ever before, to be able to study genetics of the virus to such an extent. So literally thousands upon thousands of samples, if not millions by now, have been sequenced all over the world throughout this pandemic. And we have exquisite evolutionary understanding of the viruses, because we're comparing genome to genome to genome of SARS-CoV-2, and we can literally see how it's changing all the time. But in terms of helping us finding solution, I'm not sure we're there yet, because we don't fully know how to necessarily correlate the changes to the outcomes yet. We are getting much, much better at predicting it. And the reason why is because some of the mutations come and go. And if we've seen them before, we can start potentially correlate to some clinical outcomes, or understanding how specific mutations might help the virus interact with their receptors in order to gain entry into our cells, or how certain mutations might help the virus avoid binding of the antibodies and neutralize it. So, but nevertheless, that's still, it's still part of modeling. It's not necessarily, we're not there yet in terms of knowing how we could use the genetic information in order to find something like a cure. So we don't know yet how to necessarily target the virus by exploiting its genetics. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, that's not.
Now, the same thing is now being applied for monkeypox as well. So, as we all know, there is an outbreak of monkeypox. It's now been labeled by World Health Organization as area of concern, that it needs to be now monitored, because an attempt to spread the limit so that it does not develop into a pandemic on its own right. And that's the risk now potentially we are facing. And once again, the genetics of that virus is also being monitored in great detail. And once again, we can map the evolutionary tree, and we can understand how that virus relates to the previous outbreaks we've experienced with monkeypox.
Now, you mentioned that you started a company, Genomics, and for those that came on a little earlier, they saw your logo as you came in. Tell us a little bit more about Genomics, what you do there, and why is gene sequencing so important, especially when it comes to our understanding of our personal health.
So going back to my prior statement that the genome, or the entirety of your DNA, is the program code that runs you. It's the program code that developed you. And every single one of us will come with some, let's just call it deficiencies. No one is perfect. And the reason why is because the code is so huge. And some of these deficiencies might be fairly benign in their outcomes, and some of them might not be. And they could be predisposing you to potential future problems, even though an individual might look totally fine at the moment, no symptoms, no clinical symptoms. And yet you could learn from genetics that, hey, because of the particular mutations or variants, the mutations is being phased out from use in science, and it's being substituted by the word variant, just like the word variants being used to describe the different variants of the virus. And you can start correlating specific mutations in the genetic code to potential clinical outcomes. However, that's never guaranteed either, because biology is so complex. You can have other mutations that could have positive impact, and they could potentially negate the negative outcomes of the bad mutations. So nevertheless, you can actually start looking at that and see, based on historical data, these specific genes with such mutations usually will lead to such outcomes. So that's for healthy individuals if they want to screen themselves. So that's screening yourself for potential problems. And if you discover that information, then you can take potentially some mitigating actions and plan appropriately for the future. If, of course, you are not afraid to look at that information. And that's not for everyone, because for some people, learning that information could cause anxiety, and stress obviously is also potentially problematic. So that in its own right might cause more harm than it was worth getting the information. So it's not for everyone. But there is also the other side where people might already have symptoms of specific disease, and one could use this technology to determine what the problem is. If it's symptoms of a condition that, for example, is not diagnosed, where medical system is failing to properly diagnose, looking at your genetics can be extremely powerful, because it could potentially find a mutation, and without knowing what clinical test to apply to figure out what the problem is, once you have a mutation, you know which biological pathways might be affected, and voila, you know potentially what the issue is, what the disease might be. Another alternative would be, if a person has cancer, you could look at the cancer biopsy and determine as to what genetic mutations drove that cancer development, and that can potentially influence treatment of cancer as well. So there's a variety of different ways of how this technology can be applied. As you can see, the way I described it, everyone could potentially benefit from use of such technology, whether you are in good health or whether a person is unfortunately suffering from some condition symptoms.
Well, I'll tell you, I appreciate your honesty in letting us know that it's not for everyone, especially those that are afraid to find out. But I would implore those that can to really take time to look at what's happening in your system on a cellular genetic level. Therefore, you can plan to improve. You can plan for the future. In fact, you can plan for your offspring if you plan to have any, or if you have some that have children else. Hey, this runs in our family, but we have control. And that's the whole idea, is to have tools that will give us control over our overall health, well-being, and quality of life. You see? So, Doc, that said, okay, without disclosing any dark secrets of your own genetics, okay, have you had yourself sequenced?
Of
And
course.
and could you tell us what is your evolutionary path? Are you, a million years from now, will we see you with a huge brain and long legs from hiking in the mountains?
So possibly, yes, from hiking in the mountains, not genetics. Remember, genetics you're born with is not subject to modification. So there sometimes, yes, you can. That's called gene therapy. It's very limited in how frequently that technology can even be used, and it's limited in its outcomes. So we're not talking about ever altering your genome or your genetic code. However, what can be changed is how your genetic code is used. That's where your quality lifestyle comes in, because it's fairly well established that irrespective of your genetics, whether you have good genes versus bad genes, if you take care of your lifestyle, you can always improve the outcomes. And we all know what that is. It's exercising, not smoking, healthy diet, and good quality sleep. We all know this, right? And the question is the discipline to execute, right? We all know that, but that's how you can actually improve the outcomes. And even in people who have been diagnosed with different genetic conditions, if these people employed better quality lifestyle than people with same mutations, for example, you fare better. And that makes sense, because ultimately what you do is you improve the quality of your immune system, something that we should all consider right now, because we are still in a pandemic and we don't know what the outcomes of this pandemic, we don't know how it's going to end yet. No one is really attempting to predict that scientifically. We're just simply assuming, okay, it's endemic, but we don't know what the next wave might look like, right? We're just hoping that the trend we've been observing with the Omicron, where it's getting milder, will continue, but we simply don't know. So the maybe good advice would be boost your immune system to the greatest degree you possibly can, and good quality healthy lifestyle can definitely achieve that for you to a degree.
Yeah. Well, this may be getting a little metaphysical on you, but I had to ask, because when we drill down, we find this incredible connection to everything. So, have you had any or seen any studies on the effects of meditation, breath work, that sort of thing, on a person's genetics, on their epigenetics, if you would?
Not specifically on epigenetics. This is an area that unfortunately is not investigated as much as I think it should be. And the reason why is because the focus is always on intervention, medical intervention through drugs and or surgeries and so on, right? Very little attention is being paid to how we could potentially be positively influencing ourselves through psychological means, like you mentioned, meditation. But to give you an example where I did see some literature, was this lady, I can't remember, I think it was Dr. Turner, I believe her name was, who for her doctorate degree, she had very interesting research. She looked at stage 4 cancer survivors for cancers that normally at that late of a stage of cancer development would be very, very poor outcomes, meaning, of course, the likelihood of death was very high. And she specifically looked into as to why these people fared better. And out of the top 10 reasons that she put together based on simply interviewing, I think, hundreds of such individuals, it turned out that your state of mind was one of the biggest influencing factor. And so that's positive attitude and this concept of transcendence, where you realize that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. So very interesting concept for sure. But that's not easy, I guess, to maybe empirically study scientifically. So maybe this is one of the reasons why we're not paying too much attention. But that's something that that I find somewhat fascinating, because I just released a video on the YouTube channel which discussed the positive impact of optimism on longevity, and I found it so fascinating. And so I definitely want to start studying this a little bit more and potentially produce more content related to that. And the reason why is because, while, believe it or not, optimism is heritable, it has a genetic component, but it can also be trained. So that means and its positive influence on health outcome is so enormous that the authors of that publication that I was reviewing in that video even discussed that we should seriously be considering this as a proactive health intervention in order to improve our population healthcare. And because it's simply something that we can train psychologically. You don't need to take medication. You don't need to do any intervention. It's simply psychological training in order to reframe how potentially you are thinking about different subjects, and that can benefit your health down the road. So something that I definitely want to look into in great detail, because I was really, really taken aback. Hey, like, it's incredible how big of a positive influence on longevity it had. Basically, people those who were optimistic ended up living longer in comparison to the average or pessimistic personalities.
Speaking of cancer patients, I'll tell you one experience I had in the hospitals when we had a patient who was, she was stage 4, and the doctor was telling her, get your affairs in order. You don't have that long. It's going to be about 6 months, 9 at the most. And she looked at him and she said, I'm going to tell you something. I have a granddaughter and I will be at her wedding. I'm going to dance at her wedding. 3 years later, she did. And then the doctor came back and said, well, congratulations, but I got to tell you, it's a miracle that she stayed this far. She goes, I got another granddaughter.
Right on. And you know what? This is where I wish we investigated such individuals in far greater detail. The reason why is because here you are, a doctor is giving you this concept that you're about to die in this time frame. And says who, right? Biology is so diverse that any outcome is potentially possible. And but of course the doctors was speaking through their general experience based on the battery of tests they were performing. Typically would indicate that's perhaps what the clinical outcome is expected, but nevertheless shows you that no, that's not guaranteed at all. And we should be studying these individuals, not just in terms of their biological makeup, but also what did they do and what were their lifestyle choices, if you will, so that we can learn more. I think every doctor wants their patients to do the best. And especially oncologists, right? Because oncologists, they face so much trauma. We as a population underappreciate what a difficult environment it is to work in as an oncologist, where you have to face so much grief and so much sadness, and you see your patients die. Those doctors are not left without a mark because of bearing witness to that all the time. Very few people appreciate that this is extremely hard on them as well. So I think oncologists, if we had it figured out from a scientific point of view, they probably would love that information as to, hey, if you, without medical intervention, if you simply do this or this and this with your lifestyle, that's going to help you, right? Positive attitude maybe is one of them, but in order for oncologists to employ this type of approach, we need scientific proof, right? That's how our medical system is composed. We rely on treatments that have been proven to work in a given fashion. And if they haven't been proven, even if there's anecdotal evidence, it's as if it doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the big challenges, because there's this whole discussion of placebo versus nocebo and its effect on a person's body, the positive effects that it can have. And, how do you really quantify that ultimately, for people? And yet, time and time again, anecdotal as they may be, we hear the stories of people who get better due to their, the positive environment that they develop for themselves internally and often even externally. That's the main thing. But I'll tell you, you have such a wealth of knowledge, and we haven't even really touched on all of the YouTube content that you have, because I think it's amazing. And he's like a man of all seasons. He's wrapped up in his scarf and his thing, or he's out in his shirt, but he's constantly giving information that all of us can use, regardless of whether you're in Canada or whether you're in South America or wherever you are. If you speak English or Polish, you can also get this information, and it'll benefit you. Dr. Mikolaj Raszek, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I've got one more question that I ask all of my guests. And, with your incredible journey, you started, founded, and take part in running two companies. You're an extremely knowledgeable walking encyclopedia of genetics, as well as health and wellness in general. Tell us, doctor, what does it mean to you to crush your mountain?
Can I answer with two answers? Two things? Or do I have to just pick one?
You can give us 50 answers if you like.
I would say perseverance. That's one. So don't give up easily on your dreams. Your personal dreams are worth pursuing, I think. So definitely perseverance. So you need to have this approach that, hey, it's okay to sometimes make sacrifices in order to meet your goals. So not giving up easily. And number two is following your dreams, something that is passionate to you, so that I think the greatest meaning in life is to be able to create something of value. And that basically means the closer it lies to your heart in the process of that creation, the greater benefit to the society. And those benefits are far beyond, I think, our own lifespan. I think each one of us actually leaves a permanent mark that can last for a very, very long time, because all of us contribute into driving how the world is continuously evolving and developing. None of us would be where we are if it wasn't for our ancestor giving us the fertile ground to be where we are and take from that. And we're doing exactly the same thing. We are now creating new ground for the future generations to be able to evolve from that, be inspired on that, and create yet something else new. But without inspiration in the first place, that others that preceded us were able to give us, we wouldn't be able to create what we're creating right now. So it's a continuous cycle. So make sure it's close to your heart.
Wow, such profound wisdom, and we really want to thank you for being here and giving us this insight, giving us this information. Friends, I know we went deep here, and there's a lot of stuff that we did not unpack, but let's just put it this way. As I've said before, you have to look into whatever aspects that you can to take charge of your health, and understand that you're not just doing it for you. You're not just doing it for yourself. You've got family, you've got children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And if you don't have them now, you might have them later. Why not create a state of health in your body that you can pass on as your biological legacy? Why not turn the clock back on yourself? And so you might say that you're 60 years old, but on the inside, how about being 40? Dr. Mark Hyman, he likes to tout that he's 62, but biologically he's 42. Well, that doesn't mean we can't get there. It's just a matter of looking into what it takes to get there. So again, Doctor, I want to thank you so very much for being with us. And now, again, how do I say thank you so much in Polish?
Dziękuję bardzo. And
one more time, I want to make sure I do it right.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Very well. And thank you for having me as well. It was a pleasure.
Like I said, friends, always do the best and take care of yourselves. And I always tell you this, don't just climb your mountain, crush through it. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a whole lot.